Thank you, David. Dr. Preston Moon, in his powerful keynote address yesterday, and also in his book, The Korean Dream, said that the North Korean reunification is fundamentally a moral issue. He also said denuclearization is linked to reunification, which makes that a moral issue as well. I agree. Earlier this year, Secretary Rex Tillerson's State Department issued its annual human rights report, which indicted North Korea as one of the world's worst and cruelest regimes. As Greg Scarlato's work has shown, its slave labor camps match the horrors of Nazi death camps and Soviet gulags in the last century. In his speech before the South Korean National Assembly last week, President Trump quoted a person who escaped from the North. The man said, "When I think about it now, I was not a human being. I was more like an animal. Only after leaving North Korea did I realize what life was supposed to be." The treatment of the North Korean people by 3 generations of the Kim regime can be fully expressed in one word: dehumanization. Yet within a few weeks of the State Department's scathing human rights report, Secretary Tillerson told the United Nations Security Council, "America's goal is not regime change." In a subsequent press conference, the Secretary expanded on his message to Pyongyang and Beijing. He said, quote, "We do not seek a regime change. We do not seek the collapse of the regime. We do not seek an accelerated reunification of the peninsula. We do not seek an excuse to send our military north of the 38th parallel. And we're trying to convey that to the North Koreans. We are not your enemy. We're not your threat." Tillerson also said, "Since 1995, the U.S. has provided $1.3 billion in aid to North Korea, and we look forward to resuming our contributions once the country dismantles its weapons programs." What does this apparent contradiction mean? How can the United States condemn the North Korean regime as perhaps the worst humanitarian nightmare on earth, while at the same time pledging to keep it in power indefinitely and even provide further economic subsidies? The answer lies in the last few words of Tillerson's offer. Future contributions would come only after North Korea dismantles its nuclear programs. In other words, the United States, the world's leading exponent of universal values and human rights, is saying that its first priority is denuclearization. It is willing to leave that horrendous regime in place in order to avoid the alternative of another war on the Korean Peninsula. That is not an immoral calculation when we consider that such a war, quite possibly involving nuclear weapons, would mean the deaths of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Koreans, north and south, and thousands of Americans. But, some ask, since war in the Korean Peninsula and in the region would be such a terrible outcome, why is the Trump administration threatening war in order to eliminate North Korea's nuclear weapons program? Why not just continue to live with the threat as previous administrations have done for the last 3 decades? Why not accept the freeze-for-freeze proposals put forward by China and Russia? North Korea stops building or testing nuclear weapons and missiles, and South Korea and the United States end their joint military exercises. Wouldn't that avoid another Korean War? The answer has 3 parts. First, North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are completely illegal, blatant violations of international non-proliferation treaties and UN Security Council resolutions. U.S. ROK exercises, on the other hand, are entirely legitimate activities, conducted routinely by militaries around the world. It would be dangerously foolhardy to accept an ongoing North Korean nuclear and missile capability, even if frozen, while surrendering a normal, legal international practice. The potential North Korean aggression would still be there, but the U.S. ROK defensive capability would be diminished. Second, given Pyongyang's consistent record of cheating on international commitments, it would be difficult at best to confirm its compliance with a freeze agreement. How would we know with any confidence what the baseline is? Rather than arguing about how many nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles North Korea had to begin with and whether they're being added over time, getting to zero and remaining there is far easier to understand and to verify. As for the morality of risking war to get rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons, the policies of negotiations, sanctions, and relying on China to restrain its ally have all clearly failed. The threat from the Kim regime has grown exponentially, as has the risk of war itself. The nuclear canister can no longer be kicked down the road. As Secretary Tillerson and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley have both said, there is no more road. The international community, led by the United States, must act. China must compel Pyongyang either to give up nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs or to give up power. And China has the economic and diplomatic clout to make that happen. We are often told Kim Jong-un may be dangerous and erratic, but he is not suicidal. Well, then faced with a credible ultimatum from China, along with security guarantees and economic aid, he would have to choose regime survival. The West must demand that Beijing present Pyongyang with an offer it cannot refuse. Finally, considering North Korea's ongoing state of aggression against South Korea and its declared intention to reunify the peninsula under Kim's totalitarian rule, the danger of an imminent outbreak of war is ever present, even without any action by the West. Seen by North Korean leaders as weakness, which invites strategic miscalculation and military adventurism, is how experts have described that policy. It would be better to lance that boil now and compel a rollback of North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities before the danger becomes even greater. Once peaceful denuclearization is accomplished, there will be opportunity for creative negotiations with Beijing and Pyongyang to accelerate the rehumanizing of the North Korean people that we should be pushing for simultaneously. Much of that can be achieved without total regime change, though not without some change in the regime's behavior. However, if Pyongyang precipitates actual conflict with the West by further provocations that cross the red lines of the United States, South Korea, and Japan, then the moral calculation changes. There are three scenarios to consider. The first is a so-called surgical strike or preemptive prevention operation. It would commit to Pyongyang and Beijing, as Secretary Tillerson has done, that we do not intend to overthrow the Kim regime or to occupy North Korea, unless it retaliates. If the Communist allies accept that assurance, and there is no retaliation against Seoul or the U.S., either by nuclear or conventional means, then there could be discussion of ending sanctions and resuming the flow of economic aid that Tillerson mentioned. There would have to be verifiable assurances that the aid would be used to improve the lives of North Korean citizens and not to enrich the Kim regime, its elite supporters, or the military. The second scenario would occur if Pyongyang does retaliate against South Korea or the United States, but China stays out of the conflict. That would mean war between North Korea and the West. In those circumstances, the Trump administration is unlikely to repeat the error of the Korean War and allow the aggressor regime to remain in power. Washington would have to work with Beijing to reunify the Korean Peninsula under a democratic government not hostile to either China or the West. If China does intervene, which is the third and most catastrophic scenario, it would mean war between the United States and its allies against North Korea and China. It would be a replay of the First Korean War, but with higher costs for all and devastating consequences for North Korea and China. It would be the merciful end of the Pyongyang regime and reunification under a democratic Korean government that would not soon forget Beijing's second aggression against South Korea. Such a war would destroy all the economic gains China has made over the past 4 decades and would endanger the very survivability of Communist Party rule in China. That is why it is the least likely scenario. Let us hope that the Trump administration can avoid all three conflict scenarios, but that will depend largely on China. Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is the most urgent security need. Reunification of all the Korean people is the ultimate goal. The sooner the better. Both are moral imperatives. But so is the rehumanization of the North Korean people, and that is something the international community can do without waiting for the other goals to be met. It is happening now, but at a very low level. Much more needs to be done to get information and messages of moral support to the North Korean people. During the Cold War, Václav Havel, Nathan Sharansky, and Lech Walesa all said that the messages they heard from the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe bolstered their spirits because they knew the outside world had not forgotten them. Can the North Korean people today say they have not been forgotten? From what we heard from Mr. In-Tek So yesterday, the South Korean people themselves could play a much greater role. It seems they need as much information about their countrymen in the North as the North Korean people need about life in the South. Thank you.